President of the United States.
Hello, you all. Hi. Thank you all very much. The members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent.
On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii.
I remember listening to the radio, and you couldn't believe that a small country like Japan would attack. There goes the whole future.
And so when you went to school the next day, I assume you went back to school the next day?
Next day. It was almost as if nothing had happened, but you could tell that there was some tension, you know, everybody was kind of scared. But I do know that most of the teachers were very protective and very kind.
On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, giving authority to the Secretary of War to move any persons on the West Coast who were deemed possible threats.
First, we have to think about just the general sense of panic in the country, because the executive order is about 74 days after Pearl Harbor. So that's time for, first, a lot of internal discussion about what are we going to do generally, but about internal security in particular.
And 1 month later, on March 18th, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9102, which created the War Relocation Authority for the supervision and maintenance of so-called relocation centers.
We weren't charged with any crime, and we didn't have a trial, but there was nothing we could do.
I'm sure as a child I could sense the fear and all the calamity and all, but I don't know, there's something about my parents also probably tried to insulate us and make us feel comfortable as best we could.
What the federal government said was basically, we cannot have these Japanese American people living near our military bases when we are at war with the Empire of Japan. And that was the federal government's stance for decades.
We need to add to that the anti-Asian context, which goes way, way, way back to the Transcontinental Railroad and all sorts of Asian exclusion acts and laws that actually said you cannot own land, you cannot work in this occupation, you cannot do this, you cannot do that.
So what happens when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor is sort of this convenient accident where, we've got a reason now to round up all of the Japanese who are taking our business and taking our farmland, etc. And so they do.
And so the evacuations began. Some Japanese had been arrested in the days immediately following the attack in Pearl Harbor. But the first official internees were not removed from their homes until March 21st of 1942, 105 days after the attack. One Japanese-American man recounted being made to unload the piles of suitcases and belongings from trains, loading them into semi-trucks. We were hot and sweaty and sitting, trying to conserve our energy, when one of the military guards, standing with his gun, suggested that one of us should get a drink of water at the nearby water faucet and try to make a run for it so he could get some target practice.
We were renting a house, and our landlord lived in the back, and she told us that we could leave our possessions there, and she would take care of it. The irony is that her husband was a German, unnaturalized German from Germany. He didn't have to go to camp. My father, who was born as a U.S. citizen, had to go to camp, you know.
We, as I recall, we did go back to school. Things had changed, though. I think our friends, non-Japanese friends, didn't really know how to treat us. I believe that they felt if they were too friendly with us, they would be labeled Jap lovers.
On the trains, many families were separated into different cars, with sleeping areas for invalids or mothers with small children. Most evacuees had to sit up for the trips, some of which took several days. And the trains were dark and stuffy because the military required that the windows and shades all be kept closed during the trips. These trains took the Japanese Americans to the military-run assembly centers, like the one at the Santa Anita horse racetrack. These served as temporary holding places until construction was completed on the concentration camps.
Do you remember the day you left for Santa Anita?
No, I don't.
When you arrived at Santa Anita, where did you live?
Well, I don't remember too clearly, but my parents said we lived in a horse stall and that it still smelled of horse manure.
It was horse stables that were not actually cleaned out. They just whitewashed the manure, and so the stench and all the hay, the pollens, whatever, it's all very visible part of my memories. And so I think
Later on, barracks would be erected at Santa Anita, but in those early days, horse stalls, the parking lot, and even high-rise stands all served as sleeping quarters. During the day, many of the men worked as war effort labor, making camouflage nets for the government that had imprisoned them. There were 16 assembly centers, used as temporary holding while the concentration camps were being built. The first assembly center to open was at Manzanar, California on March 21, 1942, which later served as a concentration camp. The assembly center at Santa Anita, California racetrack opened later on March 27th. While most of the camps were west of the Rocky Mountains or in the American Southwest, there were 2 camps east of the Rocky Mountains, both in the Deep South. These were the final camps to open. The first opened October 6, 1942 in Rohwer, Arkansas. The second only some 30 miles south near the small town of Jerome. Due to the camps, these 2 small Arkansas towns became the 3rd and 4th largest communities in the state by population. The capital of Little Rock was the largest.
They said, we're going to Arkansas. I knew nothing about the geography of this country at the time, you know. And they said, it's going to take us 3.5 days. And I said, I had no idea what 3.5 days was going to be like on a train. We go to the train where they had the food, you know, and they'd serve you meals. And to this day, I'm galled by the fact that they expected us to tip those people. Hey, they're serving us. I understand that, but hey, this should be tipped by the government, not me. You know, yeah, I thought that was kind of crude.
Most of the war relocation camps are on the West Coast, where there is more land, and obviously that's where the majority of Japanese Americans were. The ones in the 2 camps in Arkansas, Jerome and Rohwer, which were some of the last to be built. Jerome was the very last, and they didn't even actually complete it all the way. So they ended up in the Arkansas Delta.
Life in the camps varied because the locations of the camps varied. Some, like Manzanar, were overlooked by mountains where the prisoners would sneak away to trout fish. while others, like the Camp Topaz in Delta, Utah, were in the midst of miles of isolated desert.
So what the federal government required was they had to be on land that the federal government already owned. They had to be near a rail line. And if you have been to Rohwer, you will know that the rail line is right there. And also similar for Jerome, it's right across the highway now.
Well, one of the rumors was that the camp was built on a swampland. So the barracks were on stilts, above the water line,
So you took the train to go to?
Yes, to Arkansas.
Arkansas. And what
took us 3 days.
You remember that train
ride?
I
remember the train ride. I can't remember where we slept. I guess we slept in the chairs. I know that they didn't provide sleepers. And I don't remember, I think we had sandwiches.
I was going to go to school, and we were all told to line up, and we were going to be given American names. And as you know, my parents named me Takayo, and it was supposed to be a child of high ideals. And so they decided to name me Rose. Again, and this is now in my adult life, trying to think about what kind of castrating effect psychologically this could have be for a young girl. You're made to feel that you're not a real American, and what you are is not good enough. But over time, I've kind of come to understand that it was very empowering, because I don't have to belong. I says, to the extent that I have been very successful as an advocate in the community and in my work, is I tend to be fearless.
My father died in the camps. He died in a camp called Jerome, which was in Arkansas. We had a family, a funeral. My sister, who lived in New York City, came for the funeral. She lived in New York City before the war broke out. Since she lived on the East Coast, she was not placed in the camps. She used to come to visit us, who were American citizens, imprisoned by our own government. My sister, an alien, used to come to visit us in the camps.
We sort of have two major countries that we're at war with. We're at war with Japan, and we're at war with Germany. They actually tried at the beginning of the war to intern some Germans and some Italians. But that doesn't work so well because they're white and they all blend in. It's more difficult to try to separate them out, whereas because of their appearance, the Japanese Americans are an easy target, especially since they keep so much of their culture. They're sort of this foreign entity living within the United States, and so they became, very easy for the United States to point the finger and make them the bad guy.
How do you feel about a lot of people still use the word internment
Oh.
or relocation camp?
I think those are euphemisms that the government created just to soften the blow, make it seem like they weren't such bad people, that they weren't such racist pigs putting us in concentration camps. That's like the Nazis called their camps concentration camps when they were really death camps. Hitler's solution to the Jewish problem, or the final solution. The same thing, just euphemisms.
relocation is probably the harshest of the soft language. The idea of camp coming out of the government is these are safe, secure, sanitary. They're not. They're not.
The government broke its own rules. My father was a legal resident of this country. My mother was a citizen of this country. She was born and raised here, except for the time she went to Japan. Her kids were all born and raised here. We're all citizens or legal residents. Those rights were not accorded to us during World War II. No trial. We just looked like the enemies. They didn't like it, so they put us in jail. It's not fair. It's not right. They finally admitted they goofed, right? And they paid reparations. Not enough. Doesn't cover the damage they did to what they did to my dad. Right? He could never recover from that loss. No. We got nothing, really.
When my grandson that was living up in Portland, when he was in the 4th grade, he must have told his teacher that Grandpa and Grandma is coming up to visit. So the teacher called my daughter up and says, "Do you think that they would, we would share their, our experience at camp?" So she called me up and said, "Oh, sure." I says, we start, I start talking to the kids, and kids ask different kind of questions, asking, "Do you play baseball or this or that?" And then this one little girl, she kept raising her hands. So I says, okay, I asked her. She says, why did they put you in camp? So you didn't do anything wrong. And I didn't know how to answer that. I looked at the teacher looking back at me, smiling, So the only thing I could think about was that well, when there's a war, people do things that they normally would not do. Then this girl says, "Well, that's not fair." That really touched me.
When the idea of reparations for Japanese Americans was being investigated in the 1980s, one of the things they looked at was, were there any Japanese Americans involved in espionage or other work for the Empire of Japan? And every single Japanese American that had been arrested for that was let go. There was no proof. Japanese Americans remained loyal to the United States, and they were not loyal to the Empire of Japan. There were a handful of usually Japanese, not Japanese Americans, who returned to Japan at the beginning of the war and over the course of the war, but it very small amount.
So you were incarcerated at Rohwer.
Rohwer.
What was your impression of Manzanar?
Just another concentration camp for Japanese Americans. Another ugly reminder of what the government can do to us.
What were your thoughts about when the movement started to make it into a National Park Service?
Well, good. That's all. We needed reminders like that. We needed memorials like that. We needed monuments like that to remember all the victims and to remember to tell the government not to do that anymore. Like they tried to do to the Arabs, the Muslims, and the South Asians after September 11th.
Donald Trump's answer to this question about setting up a national database of Muslims in America has set off a furor.
Should there be a database system that tracks the Muslims here in this country?
There should be a lot of systems beyond database. I mean, we should have a lot of systems. And today you can do it. But right now we have to have a border, we have to have strength, we have to have a wall. and we cannot let what's happening to this country happen illegally.
For Muslims specifically, how do you actually get them registered into a database?
It would be just good management. What you have to do is good management procedures, and we can do that.
That's right, and it's true. He did not suggest this himself, but David, in all of the back and forth today, there's another thing that Trump did not do. He did not say that he opposes the idea.
Worried history could repeat itself, the Japanese-American and Star Trek icon is speaking out about his experience during World War II. As a 5-year-old child, he was forced from his home at gunpoint and sent to an internment camp in the United States along with the rest of his family.
They're talking about Muslim registries, aren't they? And he himself talked about banning Muslim from entering this country with no basis in fact. Yes, there are some Muslims that are terrorists, but to have that sweeping statement in the same way that we were characterized as the enemy simply because we happen to look like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor. We're three generations here in this country, and yet overnight we became the enemy. Enemy aliens, they called us. We were born here. I mean, the whole phrase didn't make sense. We're not the enemy, and we're not aliens, and yet they categorized us as enemy aliens.
My father was not a businessman. He liked to read books. And as I mentioned earlier, he even wrote an autobiography in Japanese, so I don't know what it said. But he believed so much in education. He felt that this country offered unlimited opportunities for people to use their brains, extend their knowledge. He was a school teacher in Japan before he came over. Being a third son, he knew that he could never inherit anything in his family, from his family property. So he decided to try his luck in the United States. And when he found out what great opportunities there was for education here, he just thought this was the best thing for him to do, to place his roots here, because he wanted all of us to take advantage of this opportunity in this country. And he, of course, felt that one of the good things about this country was it was not a monarchy. It was not like Japan. It was a democratic institution, and he felt very strongly that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was God's gift to the people. I suppose it had to do with all the social programs that Mr. Roosevelt instituted and helped to get this country out of depression. Therefore, he believed, he was happy about the democratic way of life here. But then, when the war started, he was rather disillusioned that Mr. Roosevelt, his idol, would abandon principles and take action upon a people based only on their ancestral background. He was quite disappointed, I'm sure, at Mr. Roosevelt's action. We were treated with sort of disdain. I think we were stigmatized simply because of our ethnicity. And I think that's one of the most painful experiences, the feelings about the entire wartime experience, that we were judged not on our own character as people and persons, but simply because of our ethnicity. Something that I think goes against the grain of the democracy, of the Constitution, and every right and privilege that we're supposed to enjoy as American citizens.